Very much, everyone. I've got some music to start us off with, just to get our Beatle juices flowing. There's 3 songs. I'm going to talk a little bit about the songs while they're playing, but what's interesting is that these 3 songs feature Canadian musicians playing on the songs. Now, when you think about the Beatles, a foursome, very tight, they didn't really allow outside musicians to play in their songs, and yet we have 2.5 Canadians playing on the following 3.0 songs. All right, let's hope this works. Wish me luck. You might recognize this as a George Harrison composition off of the White Album. It's called While My Guitar Gently Weeps. This next song is also from the White Album. Also a George Harrison composition. It's called Savoy Truffle. There's a sax player in this song who happens to be from Canada. And this last song is a quirky Ringo Starr composition. It's called Don't Pass Me By. Do you hear that fiddle? It's a violin fiddle, also a Canadian playing. Thanks for joining me today. The title of my book is Us and Them, Canada, Canadians, and the Beatles. Sometimes I regret not calling it The Beatles' Great Canadian Adventure. But irrespective, that's what I'm going to take you on today. I could have been tacky and said the Magical Mystery Tour, but I thought I'd come up with my own. This is the Beatles' Great Canadian Adventure. What I set out to prove in the book, my hypothesis, was the contribution of Canada and Canadians to the music, art, history, and phenomena of the Beatles as a band and as solo artists, but just as importantly, what they gave us in return. And to start off, I'm going to do 2 readings to give you a sense as to what led me to write this book. So I'm going to read directly from the introduction chapter. All right. Around the time I was born, a struggling, little-known bar and dance hall band made up of teenage boys and early 20-somethings from Liverpool, England, were dodging flying bar stools and beer bottles while ducking under metal tables from the wailing fists of drunk and disorderly Canadian soldiers. The band was called the Beatles, and they were playing away from home in the seediest city on earth. That otherwise insignificant piece of bar-brawling history involving the early Beatles and Canadian servicemen in Hamburg in 1961 was my jumping-off point for a book about the Beatles in Canada. It's very Canadian of me, and perhaps of you as well, to fixate on what other people think of us. And when I heard about the fight, my thoughts automatically turned to a barely 18-year-old George Harrison. What must that junior Beatle have thought about Canada when presumably his first experience with anyone or anything Canadian involved a Donnybrook at Hamburg's top 10 club that was so large and so nasty it was only quelled by volleys of tear gas. You know what they say about presumptions. As I set out to read, click, and reabsorb myself in the Beatles' history, it was soon clear that my presumption about George Harrison was blown to bits. The youngest and most impressionable Beatle had a Canadian-born niece and nephew, along with a sister, uncle, brother-in-law, and cousins living in Ontario and Quebec. And the boots he was wearing to kick off those beer bottles at that bar in Hamburg, they came from Ontario. My second reading. So I kept at it, wondering what other historical arches placed Canada and Canadians in the Beatles' orbit. Sure enough, every upturned stone revealed more and more fascinating Canadian connections to the Beatles, whether tracing their activities while in Canada or discovering which Canadians had an impact on or nearly nullified the music that has coursed through our veins for the last 50, 60 years. Why write this book? Well, I've given you a pretty good sense of that. It's a collision of my 2 passions. I love my country. This is the country in which I was born. It's the country that my parents chose to immigrate from in the 1950s. And so it's a collision of my passion for the Beatles and my passion for my country. I also must say that Canada is very underrepresented in many things around the world, but inclusive of that is its history with the boys from Liverpool. And I'm going to talk about that in the next slide as well. But I will say this. There is no other country on earth that can rightfully take its place with the UK and the USA in the Beatles' history as Canada. You cannot write a book about the Beatles in Poland. You cannot write a book about the Beatles in Brazil, and you sure as heck can't write a book about the Beatles in Japan. You might get away with a book about the Beatles in Germany. You might. But again, Canada, solid second-tier footing in the history of the band. Wait till you hear more. That was proven to me on a trip to England in 2010. I was working for Bombardier Aerospace. I was doing business in the UK, and I was bored out of my mind. I had to get away. We were based in London. So I did sneak away. I pretended I had work in Liverpool. Didn't. But I went to the mecca of Beatlemania, which is called the Beatles Story. It's a multi-level museum, for lack of a better word, that has the greatest singular collection of Beatlemania on earth. Every Beatle fan needs to go to the Beatles Story in Liverpool. Except that I had my Canadian hat on and my Canadian sensibilities about me, and I started seeing mistakes. Okay, this is a photograph I took, talking about their second big international tour in 1965. Beatles came to Toronto, right, which is in Canada, right? But it's called the American Tour of '65. So right away, my heckles are starting to rise. Where did they play in their American tour of '65? Something called Toronto Maple Leaf Stadium. Have you heard of Toronto Maple Leaf Stadium? Maybe it's the Gardens. Yes, it was Toronto Maple Leaf Gardens. So they made mistakes in a rare reference to Canada. I walked away from that visit to Liverpool and I said, Johnny, you can do better than this. A little bit about the book. The project began 10 years after that Liverpool visit. I had to save up a little bit more before I can retire, so I retired and started working on the book. I used over 200 sources. There's lots of Beatles sources out there. I mentioned the 8,000 books, right? Reference material, online films, song facts, album notes. I interviewed 18 Canadians, some of them ordinary, like you and I, some of them very luminary, very important. It contains 312 pages, 11 chapters, and there are just over 40 photographs and images. These are, and the photographs, by the way, I have the licensing to use them. In some cases I paid for them, in some cases they were granted to me because people were sympathetic that I was writing my first book and they didn't want me to spend too much money on it. I've been very lucky with publicity, very, very lucky. I'm actually good at it. And I've got stories about myself in the book, in the Montreal Gazette, the Toronto Star, the Midland Today, Sharp Magazine, CTV Barrie had me on a couple of weeks ago. And the new magazines, the new audio magazines of our world are called podcasts. I've done a few of those as well, including a delightful one called Beatles Women, because there are so many female Canadian connections to the Beatles as well. I'm going to get into that. Now, we are a large country, are we not? We have 10 provinces and 3 territories. What if I told you that this is not a book about Toronto, not a book about Montreal, and perhaps not a book about Vancouver? Well, it is about those places, but it's about a lot more. The Beatles spread their love in all 10 provinces of our country. I've got stories from Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Manitoba, Alberta, what have I forgotten? Nova Scotia. And one from the Yukon. So I've got one territory in all 10 provinces of research for my book about the Beatles in Canada. Pretty good. When you think about who gets all the attention, 60% of our nation's population is in 2 provinces. And you can argue that 60% of the action is in 2 provinces, Ontario and Quebec. Yet, I said to myself, it would not be a book about Canada if I did not at least have one, and I have more than that, from every single region of the country.
Newfoundland?
Newfoundland and Labrador. And actually, I've got one pre-Confederation from Newfoundland and Labrador as well.
Yeah.
All right.
1940.
Now, the tale that I tell in my book covers the arc of the Beatles' career. You think about it, the beginning, the middle, and the end, right? So, their early days, their formation, their fame, their breakup, their solo careers, I even get into their kids. And the years are more or less 1953 to 1922. So we're talking 70 years-ish of Beatles history with Canadian connections. I'll give you some small examples here. Hi there. Hi, Sandy. Good to see you. I'll give you some small examples. Do you remember I mentioned the bar fight in that club in Hamburg, right? They're on the roof of that club in Hamburg, and looky, George is wearing his Ontario boots. That's what he was kicking beer bottles with from the stage. I mentioned George Harrison had family in Ontario and Quebec. That's his sister. Sadly, she passed away this past Monday. Louise Harrison died at 91 in Florida on Monday. She lived in Ontario and Quebec, and while she was in Ontario, her and her husband produced 2 children. So we have two blood relations of a Beatle born and raised in Ontario. That's George's niece. Her name is Leslie. So a blood relation to a Beatle as a Canadian. Not many countries can claim that. In the UK, they had family in Scotland, Ireland, and so on. John had relatives in New Zealand, but not many other countries around the world, including the US, did the 4 Beatles have blood relations with. But in Canada, they have 2. All right. Anyone guess at what that might be? I know it's far away. Does it look like a chump chart or a music chart from the 60s and 70s? For those of you younger among us, back in the day, radio stations would publish charts of their most popular songs in Toronto. The famous one was called the Chum Chart. So if a song played multiple times, it would rise on the chart, and it would help to sell those records. It would help to get awareness for those records. This is a chart. Are you ready for this? From the station in Grande Prairie, Alberta, from April of 1963. 5 months before She Loves You was released by the Beatles. 10 months before The Ed Sullivan Show, a Beatles song appears on a chart in Grande Prairie, Alberta. Do you know how many people lived in Grande Prairie, Alberta back then? 9,000. How on earth did that happen? Not telling you tonight, but you will find out. The Beatles' famous journey to meet the Maharishi in India, where they got inspired, they learned to meditate, they wrote oodles of songs for the White Album in 1968. They had a surprise guest there, a young man from Toronto. Hi, are you here for the Beatles? Oh, and I know who you are. Hi, Mike. Come on in.
How you doing?
Very good. Please make yourself at home. The Maharishi and the Beatles met, and they spent many weeks together. The Beatles produced a lot of music from their time. And a young man named Paul Saltzman happened to be in India filming with the National Film Board of Canada. While he's in India, he finds out that his girlfriend back in Toronto had just broken up with him. He's suffering, he's hurting, he's in pain. What do you do when you're in pain, Mike? You meditate, right? He decided to go to Rishikesh to meditate, to learn to meditate, to get over his pain and suffering. Who does he meet? The Beatles. From that came some of the most intimate photography in the history of the band, taken by a young man from Toronto. His name is Paul Saltzman. This is interesting. You know, we're going through the arc of their career, right? So now we're sort of in the middle, but this is going back a little bit. Their first tour of North America was 1964. They only played 3 cities in Canada, Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. But to get to their first place, their first city, which was San Francisco, they had to fly from London to San Fran. Well, you ain't gonna make it unless you stop for fuel somewhere. Where did they stop? What's between London and San Francisco? Winnipeg, Manitoba. They stopped for fuel in Winnipeg, just a fuel stop. They were only on the ground for 20 minutes. They got mobbed, absolutely mobbed. And there's a story in there about a young man named Bruce Decker, and I won't spoil it just yet, but it is, if I had to say one of my top 5 stories in the book, the story of Bruce Decker is one of the top 5. Ringo Starr, during his solo career, utilized oodles of Canadian musicians and talent. His all-star band toured for 30 years, are still touring to this day, have had Randy Bachman, members from the band. Burton Cummings, thank you. As well as Jeff Healey, play for him on stage. He's used Canadian talent more than any other Beatle. George Harrison, the first Beatle to tour North America after they broke up in 1974. What's his first stop? Very historic. First Beatle to tour, Vancouver. You don't see it, but on the very end there is a shot of Julian Lennon and his Canadian stepsister. We'll get into that. And the top right, Sean Lennon did caricatures of his dad's songs. That little film was produced by a Canadian named Jerry Levitan. Okay, now we're getting into some highlights.